Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this third and final webinar in a three-part professional development series. My name is Jacob White. I am joining you today from Ohio University, where I am a senior executive in residence with the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. I am a trained chemist and enjoyed a past career as a science educator. And in an effort to help Ohio University reestablish the Southeast hub of the Ohio STEM Learning Network, I have put together a professional development series focusing on pedagogy of teaching science through inquiry-based strategies. Session 1 of this series provided a foundation for understanding teaching science through inquiry. What do inquiry skills mean? What is a framework we can adopt to help with productive discourse and understanding student application of science inquiry? The second session of this series provided examples of how teachers can take their current lesson plans and apply small, subtle shifts that will give students increased opportunity to practice the application of science inquiry skills. Today's session will be the third and final session in the series, and our agenda for today is to first review a framework for understanding science inquiry. Those of you who joined the first two sessions, this will be a brief review of the framework shared in the prior sessions. Those of you who did not join the first two sessions, that is no problem. I'll provide a brief review and a primer that will position you to engage in collaborative planning, which will be a majority of today's session. We're going to join colleagues from the same grade bands in breakout rooms and collaboratively discuss and share ideas for how we could make small, subtle changes to provided lesson plans with an intention of increasing student inquiry. I've developed some lesson plans to share with you today. You'll be reviewing those lesson plans and then collaborating with peers from your same grade band to creatively brainstorm ways to tweak those lesson plans. We'll then reconvene as a full group and have time at the end today for question and answer and wrap up. And again, I thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll go ahead and get started. What is scientific inquiry? The term science inquiry is embedded in the content standards. There's some disparity in how we interpret what that means, science inquiry. Most teachers understand the notion of science inquiry to be synonymous with the scientific method. Science inquiry is indeed the process of doing science. As it relates to the scientific method, we understand doing science involves several steps. Science inquiry is the process of doing science, and it involves separate skills along the way. I have condensed these skills for the sake of today's webinar into four main components. Now, we could take any one of these components and expand, add to it, but for the sake of today's session, I'm going to try to focus on these four main components of doing science. Science begins with asking a researchable question that a scientific investigation can help to answer. Next is to plan and conduct an experiment aligned to that researchable question. A third step within the science inquiry process is to then analyze data and draw conclusions based on those data, data-driven conclusions. And as a fourth component for today's purpose is to consider the process of communicating the results of a scientific investigation to others. The ability to perform these steps is the process of doing science, the science inquiry skills. These science inquiry skills are articulated and embedded within the state's content standards for science. First, in the front matter, the Ohio Department of Education presents the science inquiry skills within the framework that is also broadly applicable to engineering practices. Here we have a list of the inquiry skills that span both scientific as well as engineering practices. We see the 4 skills that I just summarized embedded here. These are expanded to more broadly apply to science as well as engineering. Asking questions, planning and conducting investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, and communicating results to others. Those are embedded in the science and engineering practices found in the science content standards. In addition to this front matter, ODE also articulates the science inquiry skills within each grade level's science content standards. These are embedded in a new component of the standards that ODE has constructed for the first time in the current iteration of the state science standards as what is called the nature of science. These are articulated in each grade level, and the category described here as scientific inquiry, practices, and applications lists the grade level expectations of students with respect to the science inquiry skills. Now, the 4 broad categories that I articulated before are found in each of the grade level standards here, but they may be expanded or include some additional components that may become expected as a student progresses throughout the K-12 curriculum. With respect to teaching science, for the purpose of today's professional development webinar for science teachers, we need to focus on understanding how do students develop the inquiry skills associated with science? How do students learn how to do science? My philosophical approach is consistent with the work of Carol Dweck, who championed the notion of a growth mindset, in which I believe students develop the ability to do science and the development of scientific inquiry skills through practice. Practice is essential to the development of these skills, as is practice essential to the development of most other skills. Students need the opportunity to engage in practice if they are expected to develop any skill. Teaching through inquiry is a reference to any teaching strategy that is intended to give students responsibility for applying the process skills of science. By being given the responsibility to apply process skills, they're given the opportunity to practice these process skills. Again, these skills are articulated for the sake of today's webinar in 4 main categories: the ability to ask researchable questions, planning and conducting experiments, analyzing data to draw conclusions, and communicating results to others. The ability to engage in any one of these skills requires practice. From the first 2 sessions in this webinar series, there are a few important pedagogical considerations that I shared, and I want to emphasize again today. If you are joining us and were able to participate in the first 2 sessions, this is a quick review. If you were not able to join those sessions, this is a pretext for what we will engage with in just a moment for the remainder of today's session. Teaching through inquiry should not be considered as a dichotomous approach. A misconception that I held early in my science education career was that a science lesson plan was either inquiry-based or it was not inquiry-based. Instead, I have found that it's far more accurate and productive to consider any given science lesson will involve a varied degree to which students are applying inquiry skills. That degree exists across a continuum. It is not dichotomous. Science lesson plans can have no student inquiry. Science lesson plans can have full, complete, open inquiry from the student perspective, in which they're afforded full discretion to guide their process. But also a science lesson can fall anywhere in between, having no student inquiry or having open student inquiry. The lesson plans that fall in between are still very important considerations, and understanding science inquiry as existing across the continuum can be a very productive, rich framework to help inform our educational practices. A second important consideration regarding the teaching of science inquiry is, again, to help students develop inquiry skills, teachers have to provide students with the opportunity to practice those skills. Lesson plans should be designed to give students responsibility for applying the process of asking questions, the process of planning and conducting experiments, the process of analyzing data to draw conclusions, and the process of communicating results to others. Each of those steps within the scientific inquiry process is important, and the development of skills associated with each step depends on the opportunity for practice. Teachers can make small shifts in their lesson plans, their current lesson plans, to help give students more opportunity to practice applying these inquiry skills, rather than looking for brand new lesson plans that have more inquiry included in them. These two pedagogical considerations are directly related and aligned to one another. Early in my science education career, I realized that because of the misconception I had associated with science inquiry and teaching through science inquiry, I didn't think it was possible or manageable to take a current lesson that I already had and make small subtle changes to give students more opportunity developing inquiry skills. The notion that I had was a lesson plan was either inquiry based or it was not inquiry based. And if I wanted to give students more opportunity to practice inquiry skills, I needed to look for a brand new lesson plan and adopt from somewhere else. Instead, I feel it's important to reconsider the notion that teachers can take their current lesson plans and make small strategic shifts or changes in the lesson plans in a manner that has a meaningful increase in giving students more opportunity to practice inquiry skills. And that review leads us to today's session. What I would like to spend most of our time engaging in is peer collaboration. You're going to be sent automatically to a breakout room that is either elementary, middle school, or high school. Based on your registration information, we have pre-assigned you to a breakout room, but you will have the option to self-select if you want to switch breakout rooms. And I have developed 3 separate lesson plans. There will be a link shared in the chat to a shared folder that presents these lesson plans. When you open this link, you will see 6 files in this shared folder. There are PDF and Word versions of an elementary science lesson, a middle school science lesson, and a high school science lesson. Depending on the group of collaborating teachers that you want to join, you need to only access one of those files, either the elementary, the middle school, or the high school lesson plan. I would also encourage you to access just the PDF. Typically, that's the quickest to access, the easiest to open. But I've also provided Word versions if, after this webinar, you want to adopt the lesson plan, tweak it, and use it in your classroom, you'll have a more editable version to access. So again, this shared folder has 6 files available to you. For today's purpose, you only need to access one of those files. Review that sample lesson plan and discuss with your peers in the breakout rooms at least 2 ideas for subtle changes that you can implement that would target specific inquiry skills. Those inquiry skills, again, for the sake of today's session, is the ability to ask researchable questions, planning and conducting scientific investigations, analyzing data to draw conclusions, and communicating results to others. What are subtle changes you can implement to these lesson plans just through discussion that could provide students with increased opportunity to practice any of these 4 inquiry skills? After about 15 minutes, we'll return to the full meeting room and we'll share ideas. Now, I'm going to show this today's assignment slide again in just a moment, but before we separate into breakout rooms, I want to offer some strategies that you can consider for tweaking a lesson plan that can give students increased responsibility for any 4 of these scientific inquiry skills. These ideas that I'm going to share are not comprehensive. They're just starter ideas to get you thinking creatively. And in your discussions today in breakout rooms, please do not limit your creative ideas to the examples that I'm going to share. I simply want to give you some starter ideas to help launch the discussions. Some ideas for subtle shifts to help students practice asking questions. If a planned science lesson is long enough, if it involves several steps, several parts to an investigation, you might provide students with a few questions relative to each step and have 1 or more students choose from a list of possible questions. Collectively as an entire class, the full investigation could be completed, but a group of students may just engage in 1 question to the experiment. If that's not possible, perhaps you could give students a list of researchable questions to select from. So from a list of questions, maybe only 1 of them is an actual scientifically researchable question. The other questions are not as easy to investigate from a scientific perspective. If you give them a list of questions that accompany a procedure or an activity, see if they can identify the most easily researchable question from that list. A different idea similar to this, have students perform a procedure, finish, and then give them a list of questions and ask, which of these questions did the procedure you just completed best answer? See if they can identify the link between scientific investigations, experiments, and the actual questions that the procedures are intended to address. Those are just some ideas to think of. Asking questions is the most difficult to give students responsibility for because the remainder of their experiment or their experience in the classroom really emanates from that question. Some ideas for subtle shifts to planning and conducting experiments, similar to ideas for questions, give students several procedures that they can choose from. Collectively, maybe 1 group within a class takes 1 procedure, another group in a class completes the different part of the procedure. The class as a whole may engage in the full scientific investigation, but each student or groups of students engage in just 1 component of the procedure. You could consider leaving out just 1 step of a procedure, give them all further instructions, but leave out 1 step and require them to determine how best to complete that 1 particular task on their own. Another idea for giving students more opportunity, allow them to plan an experiment using only a set of provided materials. Give them an assigned question, give them the permissible equipment to use, but no articulated procedure. This is an approach that can be very effective and can offer guide rails to the experiment where students are not given the discretion to engage in any procedure or any experimental approach. But if they're limited to using only a set of provided materials, that can help guide their selection of appropriate procedural steps. These are ideas for helping students to practice planning and conducting experiments on their own. Ideas for analyzing data and drawing conclusions. If you have a science lesson plan that you will have your students engage with. Look at that plan and consider these subtle tweaks. Avoid a conformational approach to the lesson plan. In other words, within the narrative or the description that you're sharing with the students, don't state expected results before they engage in the procedure. This can be concerning from many perspectives. One, they may assume any anomalous results are incorrect, unimportant, or they made a mistake, where in fact, anomalous results can be quite interesting and quite telling. Avoid a conformational approach when possible. Another subtle shift, combine results from several groups or have the entire class pool their results before drawing conclusions. So the conclusions they're expected to draw and the data that they're expected to analyze could be for the whole class, not just from their own measurements or their own observations. Some benefits of taking this approach is that students can consider better, were the results reproducible? Obtaining results once is not good science. Results have to be reproducible. And if a class pools all of the results, they can better address this issue for data analysis. Were the results reproducible? And do the results show generalities and trends? This is an interesting facet I've observed. One quick story, I was helping my son when he was in elementary school understand the notion of conservation of mass. And we engaged in an experiment where I tried to demonstrate that if you take candle wax and melt it, the mass doesn't change. So if you have solid candle wax and weigh it, and then you heat it up and liquefy it, and then weigh it as a liquid, conservation of mass would indicate that the mass should be constant. Well, we took measurements many times. I think we took about 10 measurements. One measurement out of 10 changed by a mass of 0.01 grams. Collectively, I was so shocked. My son said, "Oh no, mass was not conserved." We have evidence showing that mass was not conserved. And that made me realize there was not a focus on generality or trends. That if 99% of results show one generality or trend, we can have confidence in conclusions. Combining results from several groups or combining results from an entire class can help to address these issues. Another subtle shift to a lesson plan might be to consider swapping results and interpreting results from another group or another class. Have students engage in an activity, take measurements or observations and record them, and then give them to another group or another class to interpret. This can be an effective and very subtle change to a lesson plan that helps students practice the ability to analyze data and draw conclusions. Another idea to share is to have students identify or describe limitations of a study. This can span the gamut of experimental design considerations regarding sample size and other facets. Simply require students to describe any limitations that they can understand relative to the study that they've engaged in. These are just some ideas for shifting a lesson plan to give students more opportunity to practice this specific inquiry skill. The last inquiry skill that I have some ideas to share with before we transition to our breakout rooms, communicating results to others. Some ideas, you can require students to construct their own data sheets or data tables rather than providing them with a pre-constructed data table and ask them to simply fill in the cells with their own measurements or observations. This is a very subtle change that can provide students with meaningful increased opportunity to practice communicating results to others. Give students flexibility in the modality of communication. Allow them the option to describe or communicate their results verbally or through written narrative. or through the use of data tables. That's fine. That's probably the most common in scientific investigations, or other means of visualization, such as creating graphs, charts, or other visualization techniques. And one strategy I have taken quite an admiration of is the usage of gallery walks. If you're not familiar, gallery walks are to require students to construct their own modality of communication, either a graph, a figure, text, bullet points, whatever, to construct their own communication of results on poster paper. Have each student or group of students paste their poster paper, tape it on a wall around a classroom, and then have students rotate from one presentation to the next and simply observe the poster of one group before moving on to the other. Gallery walks are advantageous in many respects. I was not familiar with the usage of gallery walks until recently, and I'm quite a fan and would share that as an example for consideration. So those are the 4 inquiry skills: asking questions, planning and conducting investigations, analyzing data to draw conclusions, and communicating results to others. What we're going to do now is to transition into breakout rooms. There will be breakout rooms for elementary teachers, middle school teachers, or high school teachers. You have been pre-assigned to breakout rooms, but you can self-select if you choose. I have shared a folder with sample lesson plans that I would like for you to access and review. I suggest you access a PDF version of your grade band lesson. The elementary lesson is properties of bubbles. The middle school lesson is focused on density, and the high school lesson is focused on phase change temperatures. Review these lessons. They're quite brief. I tried to draft them with a consistent format and structure. After you've reviewed them, discuss within your breakout rooms. What are some ideas you can come up with for subtle shifts that would tweak the lesson plans in a very strategic, targeted manner to give students more opportunity to practice any one or more of the inquiry skills? Again, for today, those inquiry skills are summarized here as these 4 components: asking questions, planning and conducting experiments, analyzing data to draw conclusions, and communicating results to others. I suggest that you do not consider how to modify the lesson plan to enhance all 4 of the scientific inquiry skills. That could be less manageable and can move towards not a subtle change to a lesson plan. And the main point I'm trying to convey is that you can take your current lesson plans and make small, subtle changes that have meaningful advantages in terms of giving students more opportunity to practice the inquiry skills of science. After 15 minutes, we'll return to the full meeting room. I'll ask for a representative from each group just to share your ideas, thoughts, and then we'll wrap up for today. Before we transition to the breakout rooms, I'm going to stop screen sharing and ask quickly, are there any questions as to what's being asked of you today? Okay, Mackenzie, were you able to share the link to the lesson plans, the shared folder?
Yes, the link to the lesson plan is in there for you in the chat. I will also broadcast it to all of the breakout rooms as well, just in case. You all have been pre-assigned into your breakout rooms according to the grade levels you engage with. So as soon as I open them up, you will automatically be shot over into your breakout room. And then in 15 minutes, you'll automatically all come back together. You do have the option to leave the breakout and self-select into another. So, some of you range from K all the way up through 12. So if you want to, be a part of high school and I assigned you to elementary, you can move freely. If you have any questions during your breakout rooms, there is a button to ask the host for help and we will pop over and help you. But if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to let us know.
Okay, have productive conversation. I'll see you again in about 15 minutes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think everyone was automatically reconnected to the full group here. what I would like to end with today is just group sharing. So we had 3 different breakout rooms, elementary, middle school, and high school. Each breakout room reviewed a different science lesson plan, and the task was to discuss your ideas for creative, subtle changes to the lesson plans that may give students more opportunity to practice a particular science inquiry skill. I joined the elementary group. We had a great discussion, and I'm wondering if Tracy, if you would be willing to share on behalf of the elementary group some ideas that you had for subtle changes to the elementary lesson plan.
Yes, I'm Tracy. I'm from Starlight Enterprises. We work with a little bit of background just with adult individuals with disabilities. So how I look at a lesson plan, I have to look at it a little differently. So we had the elementary where we had to determine the different kinds of mixtures for bubbles to make them last longer. Glycerin, soapy bubbles, just different mixtures. The lesson plan was pretty rigid. And what I had said, I would have to maybe kind of expand that and layer it for their learning, for them to be able to kind of visualize. Some can't read and move forward with their education. I would have to kind of scaffold a couple different things, and that would be not just what makes a bubble stick better, what mixture that is let's make the bubble bigger, smaller, and tweak some things visually for them and attention span wise, and have that reinforced as they're learning that glycerin bubble does stick even when it's a big bubble or a small bubble. Things like that, Jacob. Is that
excellent? Yes, I enjoyed our conversation. Another comment that was shared was with respect to students who may have difficulty reading, particularly at the elementary level. We can have wide spans of reading abilities. And an idea was shared that we could leave out the procedure altogether and just provide students with the materials, with a question that would guide their experiment, an objective statement of sorts, and then let them discuss verbally and with verbal guidance of the instructor engage in the activity. Those are subtle changes that could still adopt the same lesson plan, but then simply make adaptations to the lesson plan. Tracy focused in on one component that I intentionally implemented into each of these lesson plans. They were all 3 designed to be very rigid, very structured. I tried to articulate step by step by step by step, very clear guidance for the students to follow. That was intentional, and Tracy picked up on that with respect to the elementary lesson plan. Tracy, thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. Middle school, would anyone care to share some insights? Molly, you're raising your hand. If you would, share your thoughts on the middle school lesson plan. It focused on density.
Yes, I was elected, so here I am. All right. So my group, I think our first thing that we discussed was in the planning and conducting steps, and we thought that we could put out a set of materials, and in density we thought that of course they could have a ruler for a fixed object. For this experiment it was to find the density of an iron block, but we also talked about the water displacement method and perhaps having water in graduated cylinders and things like that. So student choice in how they would calculate density. But then we kept going for more inquiry, and our second suggestion would have been for the asking researchable questions. And so we thought maybe don't even tell them the formula for density, or maybe they haven't even studied density yet at all. And so that they could research that a little bit first of all. We also came up with the idea perhaps to work it into like a storyline, like an expensive piece of jewelry has been stolen. What kind of metal might this be, and how could you prove it? And then go along with the idea that, you know, metals or elements they are identified by their properties, by their density. would be one of their physical properties.
Those are excellent ideas. I love the notion of creating a narrative or a storyline to accompany the investigation. That typically promotes more engagement of students. Excellent.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Both the middle school and the elementary groups are addressing a theme in terms of moving away from rigid structural step-by-step procedures. And a phrase that I shared with the elementary teachers that I picked up on from a colleague who is an officer with the Science Education Council of Ohio, David Verneau, shared this phrase with me before and it stuck. Productive struggle. The importance of giving students the opportunity for productive struggle. When we script procedural instructions and have students engage in step-by-step procedures, we're not allowing them the opportunity for productive struggle, and that's very important to their development of inquiry skills. Thanks again, Molly. I appreciate the middle school perspective. I think we may have had another middle school group. Is there anything different that another middle school group would care to share before we finish today? Okay, high school. We had a high school group. The high school lesson plan was structured in a similar format, very rigid. I won't go into more details, but the focus was on measuring phase change temperatures. Let's see, Robert, I see a thumbs up. I'm hoping that's a I volunteer symbol. Would you care to share on behalf of the high school group? What were some of the subtle changes your group discussed?
Sure. We decided to focus on subtle shifts that would address the communicating aspect. So our first idea was to have students present their results in a way that could be accessed through a gallery walk. So part of how this lesson plan works is they're looking at a freezing experiment and a melting experiment for a material, and they have to come up with what those freezing and melting points are. They do that by conducting an experiment over time and looking for where that freezing point and melting point are for the temperature. So what the gallery walk does is it allows students to look at the full range of class data. That would give them an opportunity to see trends and consistency or maybe inconsistency between the results. So that would allow students the opportunity to communicate their results to each other in a different way, and also perhaps come up with other things to communicate as they find, hey, we might have some experimental error going on here, which is another theme of the lesson plan. Another idea we talked about was how students could look at this as an opportunity to tell the story of what's going on during the freezing or the melting. As we might know from other applications in the college labs, when we look at a freezing point and a melting point, we look at very specific behaviors for materials like organic compounds, for example, that might look a certain way. So for students to interact with this material and know what that specifically is going to look like and communicate that to someone else. This is what you're looking for. This is the temperature it happens at. Or maybe there's a range of temperatures. That allows them further insight into how do I communicate this to someone else, and what does this look like? Is there consistency or inconsistency? So they get a very close idea of what experimental error might be by observation. So those were our ideas.
I love them. Thank you for sharing. The high school experiment in particular would lend itself to visualization techniques and sharing results and communicating to others. I love that you discussed the idea of conducting a gallery walk in which students would share their results through that approach. I'm just curious, how many of you, and if you could probably indicate through a reaction option on the Zoom meeting toolbar on your screen, just to raise your hand, how many of you have heard of or have used gallery walks in your classrooms? See a few, about half. Tracy had not. Okay, I would encourage you to explore. I have found them to be very effective. They're very flexible and really give students a lot of discretion as to how they communicate what they feel is most important to communicate. And I'm thrilled that the high school group considered that as a subtle way to shift the lesson plan. Each of these lesson plans had some common components. As I said, I intended to structure the lessons to be very, very rigid, to have very, very detailed steps to follow. And I also embedded in each lesson results that should be expected within the introduction. That's a common component to traditional science lessons, and I would encourage you to consider within maybe just one of your science lessons. See if you can remove that confirmational approach and don't share with students expected results before they engage in the procedure. There were some other common components, but we're running to the end of the session today. I hope this was a productive experience for you to take a lesson plan and collaborate with peers from your same grade band and strategize ways to tweak lessons and engage in what is typically referred to as an adopt and adapt approach to finding lesson plans and making it the right fit with your students in your classes. It's an ongoing effort. No lesson plan is complete. We can always tweak and improve and try new approaches with our students. Well, we're at the end of the session. I want to open it up for any comments or questions before we conclude for the day. Any comments, questions?
Do you have additional offerings? I ran into this one, and this is the first one I heard of.
This is the final session of this three-part series.
Well, I did, yeah, I came to all three for these, but.
I see we do have our director of the Southeast Hub joining us today. We've had ongoing discussions as to what PD sessions will offer in the future. We've had some brainstorming and discussions. I would love to be able to offer in-person professional development opportunities if and when the world returns to some greater degree of normalcy. I'll ask Nancy if you're willing to address future sessions that are being
Sure. Thank you, Jacob. So what I would say is if all of you have suggestions, you could put them in the chat. If there are topics that would be particularly helpful or useful to you, and we can strive to develop such. And we will just make sure that you're on the list for all of the sessions that we do in the future. We are thinking about doing one more event before the end of the school year on finding outdoor place-based ways of incorporating STEM, to basically end the year on a high note. So things that can be done outside on the playground, outdoors and other situations, or even in the backyard. So I'll keep you all posted on that session, and please let us know what else you'd like to learn about. Thanks.
I appreciate the chat comments, and just as a follow-up to Nancy, we will be sharing certificates of attendance by email after this session, and I will include a link in that automated message to a survey asking for feedback as to your experience in this webinar series, but also input to help us plan for future PD opportunities. So if you have ideas, needs, or interests, please be willing to share those. We value your input and value your participation today and all that you do in your classroom to help your students. If there's nothing else, we'll wrap up today's session and share out a link to the recording and certificates of attendance afterwards. Thanks everyone so much. Have a great evening. Take care.